Welcome to the next episode of Hero Examination, featuring Clarice Starling from Silence of the Lambs, one of the more interesting and complicated movie heroes, who very much is a polite and relatively good-natured soul, with a lot of skills, but also has her weaknesses and inner demons to fight. So, let's get started. Born in West Virginia, her mother died at a young age, so she didn't really know her. She was mostly raised by her father, who was a marshal in the town, and from what we see in the flashback, she really does look up to him and felt protected by him, seeing him as a role model. We then see Clarice ask if her father fought any bad guys, and he says they got away, which will later be foreshadowing for what's yet to come. Later on, her father died in the line of duty, and that safety net she had in her head was gone, and she felt all alone. Luckily, she was brought in by her mother's cousin's family, though she only stayed there for 2 months. The place she lived at was a sheep and horse ranch, and for the most part, she had no ill will towards her new guardians. But one day, Clarice went towards a horde of lambs and heard them screaming. She tried to free them, but she realized there was not enough time to save all of them, so she at least tried to save one. Unfortunately, she was eventually caught and put into an orphanage, and the sheep she tried to save was killed. This moment affected her greatly, but why? As you know, it was a sheep ranch, and the killing of lambs is something that happens there normally, so we can infer 2 things. 1, this was due to her being a kid who didn't know any better, and only reacted on emotion as most kids do at that age. All she heard was the sound of lambs screaming out for help. And 2, it was less about saving the lambs and more about having desire to protect the helpless. When she heard the screaming lambs, she automatically felt a connection to it. And this is just a theory, but considering that the cousins didn't tell her what they did with the lambs on the ranch, and the mere fact that they had her be sent off to an orphanage instead of keeping her in their custody, they were pretty neglectful people who took her in purely as a burden. And so, the only attempted family member in her life was her dad. So in a way, joining the FBI is a way of still reminding her of the only attempted family member she had in her life. While on her journey, she had to struggle in this field a lot due to her being a woman. And considering her body language and lack of questioning or surprise when she is met with sexist words and gestures, we can infer that she is pretty much used to these type of moments in her life, like how Clinton was making advances towards her when trying to interview him, seeing her as nothing more than a pretty face, to the point where he thinks she was only sent to interview Hannibal Lecter to charm him. And also how the other recruits and trainees look down on her metaphorically and physically due to her stature. She usually tries to simply brush it off and focus on her job, however she often must flex her power to both do her job and give a chance to prove herself. This also tells us why she works extra hard than most of the recruits and becomes something of an overachiever. But she also struggles with having a social life as she never has time for friends or fun, making her basically married to her job. She is also, for the most part, still haunted by her past and never once opened up. Now, let's go over her skills, starting with her intellect. She seems to be good at finding and analyzing evidence, locations, and names, even when it's not given to her at face value, which comes in handy in the line of work she's doing. Another skill is her calmness and self-control, as we can see from her body language and nervous tics that she does get nervous and a little disturbed by some of the stuff she sees from time to time, but she keeps going and stomachs it to try to solve the case. We can see this when she's looking at disturbing photos and bodies, mostly due to her having experience bottling up disturbing events in her life. She also has a willingness to go the extra mile to get the job done, like investigating places by herself and finding new clues and details by herself, and even going to other people for help and support, like when she went to one of her friends to dissect a bug for clues, or when she got help from one of her cop friends whom eventually helps her solve the case. We also see her negotiating with Hannibal Lecter to get what she wants in exchange to help her find Buffalo Bill. However, she does have some setbacks. She oftentimes needs help to really pick up on someone's motivations, as she is quick to follow up on any basic accusation and immediately go off of that alone. She also could be reckless and does not think of certain situations, as she's very much a take action type of person, and even though she's naturally skilled with a gun and being a detective, she's a bit bit overconfident. These two flaws do make sense considering that she's an overachiever and the only real pushback she got in her life was from seemingly sexist people, so she ignored any real criticism about herself. For example, she didn't look to her left during training, and she allowed Hannibal Lecter to get inside her head. This recklessness does play into her backstory, as when she was a kid, her fear took over when it came to the lambs she heard and had won. So she believes that if she sought after her fear and confronted it and stopped the so-called lambs, otherwise known as victims, from getting hurt, it would probably help her deal with her past. Only it didn't. It only suppressed those feelings. Now, let's talk about her relationships, starting with Jack Crawford, a character who appears in most of the books. Jack Crawford is a person who works with monsters to catch other monsters. Him and Lecter, despite not having any scenes together, you could tell have history and are both on to each other's mind games. Jack knew Clarice from one of his seminars, and though he does see her as a capable and smart person, that wasn't the reason why he sent her to interview Lecter. You see, on the surface, it appears that he's simply this white knight to her. Unlike most of the people in her agency, he seems to respect her and values her capabilities. So despite Clarice being pretty observant, this lets her guard down to him. As Lecter says, Jack helps her with her career and gives her special privileges to do her case. However, we get a feeling that a lot of what he's doing is simply a means to an end, a way to solve cases. The reason why he sent Clarice to interview him in the first place was because he wouldn't talk to any of the experienced FBI agents. But an inexperienced recruit that is still in training is something that will probably let Lecter's guard down. Heck, Jack doesn't even expect Lecter to help her or Clarice to get any real info from him. He just wants her to observe how he acts when dealing with a victim, keyword being victim. Unfortunately for Jack, Lecter doesn't fall for this, but decides to help her out anyway after a prisoner disrespects her. Lecter gives Clarice some leads and she manages to find and decipher them, which leads her to a clue on how to catch Buffalo Bill, something that Jack didn't intend to happen. Clarice eventually finds out about Jack's plan and is a bit upset that she wasn't in on it. However, he says that if he sends her in there with an agenda, he would have picked it apart instantly. We then see him try to reason with the local sheriff by saying they shouldn't talk in front of a woman, playing on the guy's bigotry and completely dismissing Clarice's feelings. Jack tries to reassure her that he did this simply to get rid of him and that it doesn't matter, but Clarice points out that it does matter because the people there look to him on how to behave. Now, I'm sure he appreciates Clarice on some level, but simply put, he is a man who simply does what he can to get the job done, even if he has to be a little careless when it comes to his status as a role model and Clarice's feelings. Now, let's begin with Hannibal Lecter himself. Like I said before, he quickly figures out why she's here, but simply put, he not only appreciates her skill and behavior, but also finds her an interesting case to study. Being a psychiatrist, he wants to get to the bottom of any interesting person he meets. Another possible reason why he wants to study her is she is able to stand up to him, as she points out that he is afraid to use his own psychology knowledge to look at himself instead, which offends him and bruises his pride. Once she figures out one of his clues, he said that he can help her catch him in exchange for better conditions. She lies about the offer to get him to cooperate, and whether he bought this or not is unclear. However, he does agree, but then makes a second offer. In exchange for his help, he requests her to tell him about herself, and so she has to do something she thought she never had to do in her life: open up to a person. This was probably due to most of her life being surrounded by people and authority figures who didn't care what she had to say, and being surrounded by guardians who, for the most part, she didn't emotionally connect to. It became easier to simply hide these feelings. However, by doing this, Clarice lets her guard down to him, but this time on a more personal level. She does this for a few reasons. One is out of flattery. He respects her for what she does on the field and takes the time to listen to her, unlike the rest of the people at her job. Another reason is she doesn't open up about her inner demons a lot and usually keeps those feelings bottled up. Even her relationship with Jack was more of a boss and employee relationship, a professional one, something she can maintain easily. So finally laying them out in front of Hannibal Lecter makes her form a sense of vulnerability to him and makes the connection feel more personal, and he helps her find the root of the problem instead of just suppressing it. Lecter doesn't bemoan or look down on her past trauma either, or even dismisses it as her being crazy or hysterical, which is probably a reaction she might have suspected from someone. He takes the time to understand her and analyze her past trauma and give his thoughts on it, which might have intrigued Clarice, and considering her lack of reaction when he's getting inside her head, we can infer that it seems to be getting at something inside her. But again, thanks to the clues she found and the help she got, she managed to find out what Buffalo Bill's motive is. However, Jack has already gotten his description and name down and asked her to get more dirt on him to probably put him away. But while Jack and his crew were on their way to the house, they find out that they've gotten the wrong address. However, thanks to Clarice doing more investigation, she was able to find out where he really lives. And with the moth sighting, she finds out who he really is, drawing her gun and chasing after him. She then faces him off alone, filled with fear and not backing down or running away. Clarice then shoots him dead and saves the kidnapped woman. By the end of the movie, she is promoted, but she gets a call from Lecter, who managed to escape. However, he assures Clarice that he's not going after her. This is a reference earlier in the movie where, thanks to how she treated him, Hannibal in his code will find it rude to do so. So, who was Clarice Starling? She was an underdog in a male-dominated environment, someone whose motive is solely to help out, to hide her past trauma. But in doing so, she was able to go above and beyond, and despite being played into mind games, she managed to use this to her advantage and solve the case, which made her into a hero. Thanks for watching.